This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show kicks off with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken as they explain what triggers birds to migrate and how they make the trip. Gregg Hanzlicek, K-State veterinarian, keeps the show rolling as he highlights the changes in energy and protein needs for cows and common causes of weak or stillborn calves. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show discussing changes that we've seen in the Holstein Breed over the last 20 years and whether to expect more changes down the road. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
We're going to talk a little bit about aquatic-related species. We're going to talk about migration, and I think that most of the talk will focus on migration of waterfowl. We'll have some little inklings of other birds or animals that might be migrating as well, but I thought that it's a good time of year to talk about, waterfowl migration.
So why do birds migrate?
Well, there's a lot of reasons that they do, but they're trying to optimize their habitat. And so trying to find great habitat for breeding or raising the young. And so they're going to head north where they have lots of habitat that's great for doing that. And then, heading south where there's going to be a lot more food in the colder months. That's the main reason, kind of optimizing those two things. There's a little bit of trade-off between, escaping the colder temperatures and things like that. But it's primarily to optimize the conditions for breeding and raising those offspring.
So, when a species is going back north during the summertime, what's the goal there?
Yeah, they're heading up north. They're going to go up to, the northern states or go up to Canada a lot of times. And there's variation there, obviously. But they're finding habitats that have, a lot of wetland-type habitats, very scattered pockets where they can safely breed and then raise those offspring with all of the type of habitat and the type of resources that they need to, have high clutch viability. And then, there's better feeding. There's more availability of food for them in southern states or in Mexico or South America as they fly south in the winter. And so just trying to optimize where they're at for those different conditions is really what they're trying to do.
So do all birds migrate?
No, there's two things there. One, certain species don't migrate. They like to stick around certain areas. If you go outside in the wintertime, you're going to hear northern red cardinals around here, or northern cardinals. The red's not part of their name, but red birds, and they're going to be calling, and you'll hear those in the spring as well. Woodpeckers are another common example. And so those are species that stick around. If you think about a woodpecker, that's a great example. They're eating primarily bugs or invertebrates that are growing in trees. And so those invertebrates are going to be sticking around regardless of whether it's warm or cold. It's not like seeds getting lost when plants stop growing or something like that for the year. And so food availability isn't an issue for a woodpecker or a flicker. They might stick around all the time. So some species aren't going to leave, right? Some species are going to stay around year round, but other species, might decide that they do want to migrate. And so those can be things like songbirds. And so you're going to see birds like orioles are a common one, Baltimore orioles. We start to see in Kansas, dark-eyed juncos will be coming from the north. We're the southern range for a lot of those. Titmice would be another example where, there are species that were the southern range. And so It's not always South America, but some of the other species that we have might fly south too. But there are going to be some species that do migrate. So, waterfowl are a great example there. Teal are moving south. Mallards, Canada geese, you see those big V formations. So lots of species that may or may not head south. And then there are also going to be individuals of each species that do migrate that decide to be resident individuals. And so they might just decide, hey, they want to stick around. They like where they're at. They're going to stick around this year instead of migrating. That's generally a small percentage. But you do have those resident individuals that have a great habitat, a great area that they want to thrive, and they're just going to decide they're not going to migrate.
So what cues migration for these species that do migrate?
It's primarily daylight. They're going to start to realize that the length of the day is getting shorter, right? And so that's going to cue some of their genetic response that tells them they have a period of hyperphagy where they're just going to eat a ton of food before they decide to take off. And so you're going to start to see that. Hummingbirds are a really common example of this. People that have hummingbird feeders out or hummingbirds around their habitat, if they have, they might have a garden that has a lot of native plants in it, but you start to see a really big peak in activity, and then these birds just kind of take off. And so the primary cue is daylight, but there are some other factors that are going to mix in, and weather is probably the next most common. And so something like a really cold spell coming through with waterfowl, if a pond or a wetland that they're hanging out on freezes over, they're probably going to go look for a different area. If you get a strong wind that is favorable to push them along and help them on their journey to wherever they're headed, they're going to take advantage of that. So there are some weather conditions, but most of what drives the decision to head out for the year is going to be the day length.
How do they navigate? How do they figure out where they're going? And because they can't see the stars all the time, right. And some of them fly at night and those sorts of things. That's
been a big mystery, and just in the last few years, there's been a lot of really good research that has helped provide some insight into that. You mentioned stars, and there is evidence that birds utilize stars or utilize the sun or the moon at different times, and obviously the sun and moon are moving in the skyline, so mainly those stars are kind of what they're utilizing. Things like the magnetic field of the Earth, the poles, it seems to be really important in driving them. Some of it can be learned behavior. So birds often make very similar treks every single year, following the same flyways, the same pattern every year. And they might figure out that, hey, there's a good stop if we go another 10 miles this direction or 10 miles that direction. And there's strong research that shows that, individuals that have found those locations will favor them in future years. And so they're using a lot of cues that are there all the time, but then they're learning some behavior, some landmarks along the way that'll kind of help guide them. One of the things we see that can disrupt that is artificial light. If you think about urban areas and leaving lights on, and that can disrupt some of these patterns that we see. And so just be aware of kind of what's going on and how the birds are using these different cues to find their way either north or south, depending on which way they're heading, what time of year it is.
How do these birds prepare for that migration process? How much energy do they use in those sorts of things?
Yeah, a lot of these birds that are migrating have a lot of adaptations. So you'll see things, they'll go out and they'll eat a lot. That hyperphagy just means eating more than they normally do, right? And so they'll go out and eat a lot. They also have the ability to store fat around their organs that you don't necessarily see in non-migratory species. So they have the ability to pack on a lot of weight. How much they're going to pack on is going to depend on the individual and the species, but it's common to see a 40% increase right before you take off for this migration. And the flip side's true too. Flying 3,000 miles or more, you can see a 40 or 50% loss in body weight or body condition after that. So losing a large amount of energy is also something that's very common. And birds, they might make some stops. Most species make some stops and refuel or eat a little bit or rest a little bit along the way. So there are some opportunities to get some more nutrients, but a vast majority of that energy that they're going to expend comes before they take off for sure.
So, with a trip like that where they're potentially losing 40 to 50% of their body mass, I would guess that there's some cost there in terms of survival too.
Migration does come at a cost. And so on the low end, 20 to 25% of all the species that migrate in a given year aren't going to make it back the next year.
Wow. And
there are some species, on a bad year, you might lose 75 or 80% of the individuals that are migrating. So it can be a really high impact. And dark-eyed juncos and ruby-throated hummingbirds, I know, are two species that would be in Kansas area that tend to have those higher mortality rates. But overall, as a group, 20 to 25% loss. The benefit of having more reserves in those colder months, I think, outweighs that from an evolutionary standpoint, or we wouldn't see long term see this pattern occur. And so,
Sure.
But yeah, it's definitely a risk to try to traverse that big of a distance for sure.
We're talking about, different species or even groups of species that are flying. Do they follow, big, broad paths when they do that sort of thing? Or
for the most part. And so, those would be a big path would be called a flyway. And there are 4 main flyways that are identified in the United States. And so the Pacific Flyway is out by the Pacific Ocean. We're in the Central Flyway. The Mississippi Flyway is east, follows the Mississippi River, and then you have the Atlantic Flyway along the Atlantic coast. And so, those are kind of the big paths. And so think about it maybe as a highway, that's where most of the birds are going to be. That doesn't mean that every bird is only going to drive down that one area. There can be some overlap there. But those flyways are really important areas because you have such big groups that are kind of utilizing, those areas primarily. So in Kansas, I mentioned we're part of the Central Flyway, and you see a lot of different birds that are flying along, down that path. I think, a lot of people thinking about migration focus on waterfowl this time of year because hunters are out and trying to track that pattern. But like I mentioned earlier, a lot of wading birds utilize these flyways and the habitats along them. Songbirds do too. So really important areas for birds that are migrating long distances.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you'd like to hear the full episode, it will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can search for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing getting ready for calving, but then also being prepared to take care of those calves when they get here with veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Gregg, while we're thinking about this time of year right now, what are you seeing when it comes to pastures?
Yeah, I think it's everybody or most people in this area understands it's a little strange this year that we're almost to Thanksgiving, and a lot of our pastures still have green grass. We've had a lot of places ample moisture, but the temperature's been high enough that these grasses haven't gone dormant yet, meaning they haven't turned brown. But once they do, then it's important the producers realize that the cows will probably need some type of protein supplementation. And the way to do that, the way that I was taught and I've used in practice for a long time is you can tell a lot what's going on in the rumen of a cow by looking at her manure. And so if the cow patty looks like a normal cow patty, the circular structure that's about 1.5 inches tall, that's a pretty good indication that you do not need a protein supplementation. But if the manure starts stacking up more like a horse or, just it looks like it's pretty constipated, unless they're out of water, the only other thing that will do that is a lack of rumen protein. You can supply that in tubs or cake or distillers, whatever, just telling you those bugs need a little bit of protein. So that's the first thing I do is look at that, and then also realize our cows, if we had a normal pasture season, the cows today are usually in perfect calving condition. So our goal is to keep that same condition on them to when they start calving. And if we do that, we'll have a much more successful calving season. We'll have higher milk production. We'll have a better reproduction system or season. So yeah, those kind of things go hand in hand.
And while we're thinking about those cows gestating and transitioning from that second to third trimester, what are some requirements that you see go up for these animals?
Yeah, it's amazing. And as we get into the third trimester, how fast those calves are growing, the placenta is growing, the uterus is growing, just the maintenance needs for a cow in third trimester versus second trimester as far as protein and energy. She needs 10 times more protein and 10 times more energy per day in third trimester than she did in second trimester. And if we don't provide that, then she's going to reduce body condition. She's going to use some other things to provide protein for that calf. So the metabolic demands on these third trimester cows is huge.
What do you see as some good ways to provide that 10 times more protein and energy?
Well, the first thing is I'm a big proponent of testing your forages. It's not really expensive to have forages tested, and then have somebody that understands nutritionist, an extension agent, or somebody balance the ration for your cow herd. And if we do that, especially starting now as we go into winter, the benefits are huge.
If a producer is walking out and all of his cattle's cow patties look good, is there another test if something still seems off that they could be doing?
Yeah, we've got actually a couple blood tests where if there's any idea that these cows are either protein or energy deficient, there's a blood test that there's actually a couple, one looking for protein and one looking for energy, that we can do on a subset of those cows to determine whether they actually are protein or energy deficient. And they're pretty inexpensive tests for a producer or nutritionist to run in a suspect herd.
We've been chatting about their needs going up because of their transition in trimesters, but do we see any increases in needs as we enter into wintertime?
We do, because as it gets cold, the maintenance needs of these cows is going to increase. Now their intakes will increase when it gets cold too, but we've got a gestational increase, and then we've got a lower temperature increase in the demands of these cows. So it's important that we think about both of those things as we balance our rations.
As you're working in K-State's diagnostic veterinary laboratory, what often do you see is the cause for those dead calves?
Yeah, and every year we do deal with enough weak and stillborn calves, and I try to monitor this data every year and summarize it in the order of frequency of causing of either stillborn or weak calves is number one, a protein deficiency in the dam. Number two is a vitamin A deficiency. Number three is either a selenium or vitamin E deficiency. That they go hand in hand, so we always have to group those two together. And then the fourth thing is a little bit surprising in that it's actually nitrate, excessive nitrate in the dam going into the fetus.
As you mentioned, already talked about protein. Looking at the number two cause then, vitamin A, what do producers need to be providing?
As long as they're on green grass, there's plenty of vitamin A in there. And it could be stored in the liver, but it can only be stored for just a few months. And so it's important once we start being on that dormant grass and going into winter feeding that we supplement vitamin A in our trace mineral packs. And if we've got a mineral that's listed for consumption of 2 to 4 ounces per head per day, that mineral needs to have a vitamin A concentration somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 international units per pound. And it's important that producers look for that. And then if it is labeled for 2 to 4 ounces, it's important that the producer kind of calculate how often they need to put the free choice mineral out, because if the cows aren't consuming it, it doesn't matter what level of vitamin A in there, the cows are not going to reap any benefits from it. So there's a lot of minerals out there that are called high vitamin A that really do not provide enough vitamin A for our cows during the winter. During the spring or during the pasture season, they do, but they don't during the winter time.
How can producers then handle the vitamin E selenium deficiency?
Particularly on the selenium side is that we've got areas that they have too much selenium in their soil and their forages. And then we've got areas that are deficient, and then we have some that are pretty normal. So we can't offer, or like we did vitamin A, say the amount of selenium in the mineral needs to be at this level. That's something that a nutritionist in that area is going to have to calculate for that particular producer. Vitamin E, it's really non-toxic, so it's just up to the nutritionist to put in as whatever they think is necessary for it. And so we go that route on those selenium and vitamin E.
For the weak or stillborn calves that are weak or stillborn because of being exposed to nitrates, do you ever see any issues in the dams or really just in the offspring?
I'm not involved with every case here in the diagnostic lab for the last 15 years, but I think I have most, and to my knowledge, no abortion or weak calf syndrome that was associated with nitrate also included where the dams showed nitrate poisoning, meaning there was enough in the diet to negatively affect the fetus or the calf at birth, but there wasn't enough for the cow to actually show signs of nitrate poisoning. So it's a huge issue. And I would highly recommend that if any producers that's feeding a nitrate accumulating forage or corn or sorghum sudan, one of them we forget a lot about is oat hay. Oat hay accumulates nitrates. Any of those forages, I would highly recommend that producers take a representative sample of those forages and test them for nitrate before they feed them to pregnant animals.
Now, wanting to mention just the calves, what are some key points or reminders for producers as they start putting calves on the ground to keep in mind if their calf isn't acting quite right?
Yeah, so there's a couple things where we get calls about what are called dummy calves, several days old, and now all of a sudden they just don't act like normal. They can't find their dam, or maybe they're stumbling around. And there's a couple things we always think about is that, number one, these calves could be hypothermic. They've been exposed to the cold. They're not maintaining their body temperature. And the best way to diagnose that is to use a rectal thermometer. And if it's in under 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that calf is probably experiencing hypothermia. And the treatment for that is to put them someplace where you can really warm them up. And there are several ways to do that. The best way, according to research, is to put them in a bathtub with really warm water. As we mentioned before the show, I don't know many ranchers or cow-calf producers that have a bathtub where we would do that. Research is clear, a hot lamp on those calves in an open shed is probably not going to help those calves. If we're going to use those hot lamps, we need to have them in an enclosed area so that the true atmosphere or environment around those calves is warm. And then there's other ways that I know ranchers put them on the floorboard of a pickup and put the heater on. That works well too. But the main thing is to get those calves warmed up both internally and externally as they go forward.
Sometimes do you also have to get the calf's blood sugar up?
Yeah, the other time where we hear about these dummy calves is sometimes they're hypoglycemic. Their blood glucose levels are just too low. And the typical scenario for that would be calves that where a storm comes through or something comes through, or those calves are not nursing. Everybody's bunched in the corner somewhere, and those calves become energy deficient. They don't have a whole lot of body fat to use for energy, so they kind of get energy deficient, but it's also hypoglycemic. So in those cases, the best treatment obviously is to get them nursing again, but sometimes they need a little help, oral help. That's in the form of a good quality milk replacer as a supplement to those calves. Typically one feeding or maybe two feeding is enough to pull those calves out of that hypoglycemic episode.
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. There have been several changes in the Holstein breed over the past 20 years. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk looks at three notable changes: transitioning to a little smaller cow that's more commercial and has stronger feet and legs, addressing issues in breeding primarily through genetics to improve conception rates, and making progress in milk components, looking at the fat and protein percent that we see in herds today compared to 20 years ago. He also takes a look ahead to what may be in store for fat and protein in the future.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning progress that we've made in the Holstein breed across the last couple of generations. As we look at the Holstein breed and we think about maybe what they looked like 20 years ago, we had a few things to fix. And this past week, I had a chance to sit down with one of the semen company representatives, and we discussed some of the changes that we've seen in the breed and progress that we've seen. Number one, there's been significant change in the stature and the feet and legs of the breed over the past 20 years. 20 years ago, we had some cows that were pretty tall, and we had a lot of issues with feet and legs, and for the most part, in many of our herds, we've been able to transition to a little bit smaller cow that's more commercial and has stronger feet and legs. And we've corrected many of those issues and continue to make progress in that area. Another thing we needed to fix was issues with breeding. Our conception rates and breeding records have helped us with that as we've learned different ways to handle things, but part of that is also genetics and looking for those bulls and sires that will give us an advantage when it comes to conception rates. And we've been pretty efficient at doing that. And the last thing we discussed was progress in milk components when we look at the fat percent and the protein percent that we see in our herds today compared to what we saw 20 years ago. Quite significant difference. And one of the interesting things about the discussion as we looked at the components was, so what is the limit? How far can we push this in the Holstein breed? Is it possible to have Holstein herds that will test, say, 4.8% fat? We already have herds that will test 4.5, so that's really not too much of a jump considering the progress that we've made in the last 10 years. What will determine how high we push that? Will it be genetics or will it be something else? The interesting thing, it might actually be the marketplace that determines how far we push that envelope. There are certain milk processors out there that are taking a look at the component levels that we're seeing, and they're saying, we've got plenty of fat in our system, we've got plenty of protein in our system, we really don't need more. So maybe rather than incentivizing as we've had in the past for components, we may limit those incentives. What am I talking about? Well, it is possible that a milk buyer may decide that they will give premiums up to, say, 4.5% fat, but not above that. Interesting thought that the marketplace might actually limit what we can do in terms of genetic progress as well as what we're doing in improving efficiency of our breeds. Might actually be determined by the person that's buying that milk from us. So as we go down this road, we can celebrate the increases in efficiencies that we've seen in the breed and how genetics and nutrition and all the other things that we do on the dairy farm every day have really brought about significant change and improvement, not only in the breed, but also in the profitability of our dairy farms. So hats off to those of you who are milking Holstein cows and trying to make this work every day on your farm. Just want to encourage you. You've made great strides in the last 20 years, and I think we will continue to make strides in efficiencies as we go down the road the next 20 years. Maybe a little bit different. We'll find different things that we need to fix, but one thing for sure about the American ag system, when we find a problem, we do find a way to fix it and make improvement, and we'll work toward that improvement whatever it takes. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.